we're going to take a look at the internal MIDI options that just got added to Logic 11. There's really three ways to use this, except it can really be expanded and be very complex. We're going to start with it as simple as we possibly can to help you understand it. Okay, so I've got two instruments. These are instrument tracks. This is the only place this really works right now. And I'm hoping we can add this maybe to some audio tracks in the future. Let me show you what's happening. So first and foremost, I can play the synthesizer. Right? Piece of cake. I can come over here now to my properties. This is the expanded track properties. And in addition to the MIDI input, we now have an internal MIDI in. And I can choose one of the two tracks that's here. I'm going to choose the LFO. And I'm going to, that's just what I called it. I'm going to come over here to this track. I'm going to turn off the record and the input monitoring for that other one. It's just recording itself. When I click this into record mode, so the synth is playing and the modulator plugin, which I have loaded with an LFO, is also playing to that second synthesizer. So one track now controls the other one as well. That seems pretty straightforward. We could have done that by record arming both and input monitoring both. We could use a track stack to do the same thing. So then, what's the big deal with this? Why might we want to do this? One thing we can do that's a little different is record into one track and then later on just send the MIDI over this, invisible bridge into the other track to control things after the fact. Maybe we don't want to just copy and paste the MIDI data, which is another way to do that. But I was thinking of some ways that we can actually use this, which I found really relatively interesting. First of all, I'm going to pull this down to 0. So that way you know that we're just hearing the second track all the time. And I'm going to play on the keyboard. So, interesting thing, that modulator plugin, which is sending data all the time out, is going into the second track. I can add a third track and set the input, the internal MIDI in to the same thing. And so this becomes kind of like a system-wide LFO that I can send to any of the tracks I want. We can have one track, put a number of different MIDI effects on them, and it's going to go out to all of them. And it won't be triggered by the other tracks. It'll just continually cycle on that first one. That's very similar to something I might do with a modular synthesizer. Have an LFO just spinning and controlling things out along the signal path. So that's pretty cool. It means one other thing, though, and this is a side note, if you just try to do this, you have to keep an instrument loaded on that first track. None of the MIDI effects work without a track or an instrument loaded. So you just need to keep an instrument loaded if you're going to do this. Let's talk about the next thing, because right now we're getting the MIDI sent to other tracks right before it would go to the instrument on the original track. So it's going to come out right before that into any of these other tracks that we might have here. Okay. Awesome. What if we want to do something different? Say maybe we have this original track has other MIDI effects on it that we like. Maybe it has a randomizer or something. Okay, what we can do is take the MIDI directly after any one of the MIDI effects by selecting Record MIDI to Track Here function. Typically, that's where if you put that in and you play and record into the track, it's going to record up to that point, and then the rest will just be run real time afterwards. So if I were to record track number 1, the modulator info would get recorded into the MIDI data, but the randomizer wouldn't. It would be performed live every time. So now, if I come to the second track, I can say, instead of instrument 1 input, I can say MIDI to track. And now it's the LFO that in that modulator, which is going to go to this other instrument, not the randomizer. But if we were to go to the first track and then change this down to the record MIDI to track here and do a randomization. So we can do that. We could also do any of the other MIDI control data and it would also randomize it. Okay. All of that data gets recorded into this track. Let's take this back just to the modulator for now so that the randomizer is not being written in. And let's just record for a second. Right, just that amount of data. We can open this up in the file editor and let's look at this in the automation view under modulation. This is the randomized data that we just recorded from track number 1, even though it's turned down, not being recorded or anything. This data is going into this other track. This could be useful when creating complex sounds, complex instrument connections. Let's do this just to demonstrate that a little bit. I'm going to do a synth number 2. And let's delete that first thing. So you'll see synth number 2 is essentially the same. Everything else, we have the same LFO coming in. But maybe we want to just control this a little differently. We're going to use the modifier now for a moment and change the mod wheel data. And we're going to reassign it to, let's just do volume for a moment. So now that one LFO is being switched into 2 different types of data. And let's record that for a moment. So this modifier only is changing the real-time data that came from the original one. It's changing the data. You can see the volume changing a little bit, but it's certainly not yet being written into that MIDI data. Sometimes we want to keep things live in real time. Sometimes we want to write it into the MIDI data itself. Okay, so we can take out the MIDI data at any point along the MIDI effects chain. We can do all of it by doing the whole track. The difference between those in names would be the instrument input or the MIDI to track input. The last thing we can do, which is actually pretty cool but very limited in scope right now, is that we can actually take the output of MIDI instruments, virtual instruments, and record that data. And so far, I went through all of the ones we have inside Logic currently. Sample Alchemy is one of the only ones. And so with that selected, you're going to be able to see the instrument output, Sample Alchemy, and yet it's very limited. I haven't really figured out exactly what data it's sending out. So not necessarily a great example. None of the other Logic ones currently have the capability. So that means they've been thinking about this now for a little bit. Because Sample Alchemy is not brand new, it had to be designed a certain way. Hopefully they're going to do some of the other instruments that could use this. The one that I'm doing this demonstration with is from Moog, the Model 15. And I'm assuming there are other third-party ones as well that do this. But this in particular has this MIDI bridge, and it can send out control data or just other data from various parts of this, and then we can use some of that data inside. So we could use like an LFO from here. I'm hoping to figure out how to use the step sequencer, although I haven't figured that out yet. Let's pull this output from the mixer and just put it into CC16. That's fine. And let's see if this is actually doing any data for us. I'm going to go over to the internal MIDI in, instrument output, model 15. Cool. And I want to turn off the other instruments for a moment. So right this moment, we might not be able to use this. That's going out CC16. Let's record something. And see if any data came out. Let's look at 16, general 1. And it did look like some data came out. It just isn't doing anything specific. Probably because we didn't trigger anything inside the synthesizer. But the data is coming out for sure. So we just need to set up some sort of patch that has data. We could create pretty much anything we want to with the oscillators inside the Model 15. And so once we did that, once we brought those out, then we could use that data, even if it's on one of those continuous controllers that are just random. All we would need to do is come to the modifier, say, I want to take, in this case, 16, and convert it into something else. And so we can convert it into different parameters on this instrument. In this case, let me load up the retro synth for a second. And let's do the filter cutoff frequency. So I'm going to say, I want to learn plugin parameter. I want to do this one right here. Now, the Model 15 is going to send it out on 16. This modifier is going to convert it and control the filter cutoff frequency. And so that then becomes instruments controlling other instruments and creating this additional realm of modular style synthesis and control in Logic. Now this works across all of these instrument tracks. That means we can do one at the beginning of our session, track number 1, connected to track number 89, and it's all going to work like this. There were ways to do this in other ways. Certainly we could just copy and paste data and do a lot of things, but I think that I'm excited to see what people do with this in terms of live instruments. Maybe they're using Logic on the stage. I'm excited to use it just for ease. So that means I can easily route things between the different instrument tracks. And for the future, I'm really excited to see more of this style of implementation happening. I really want to see some of these tracks be able to, connect to audio tracks and things like that. Instead of having to use the compressor type workaround to do this, I actually want just direct connection. In fact, one other thing that I could see being possible is having just like a permanent track, kind of like the master track, which is just like the MIDI source, like a little box over here in one of our properties areas where you can just load MIDI effects and have them kind of do their thing independently of the project, but connect them into any point inside the project. That would be super useful. So I'm hoping along those lines that more things come with this. That's it for this video. I hope you found it useful. Talk to you in the next one.